Food Forest Project. This is a wonderful, very interesting, very unique place to be. It's been really exciting to have some of our students come down as well and spend time here and get some exposure to not only arcosanti, but food forests, agroforestry, things of that sort. So yeah, what I'm going to talk about today are food forests, and what you see here is a picture of one of the best ones that I know of. There's a lot of good ones, including one right down the street that Casey Jones has. This one is in Colorado. It's at 7,200 feet in elevation, and it's just a beautiful mixture of all kinds of plants and all kinds of layers. And so I'll talk about what a food forest is. I'll talk about some of the advantages, some of the challenges, hopefully maybe inspire some of you to consider a food forest of your own. What I want to cover here is like, what is a food forest? Because I know a lot of you probably have no idea exactly what I mean by food forests. And you can see better over on this side. What kind of roles do they play? What good are they, in other words? And then I'll give you some examples of food forests around the Southwest and talk about some of the challenges, because I think it's important if you want to consider something like this to be aware that there are challenges with them. And then scattered all through and at the end as well, I'll give you some resources that may be of interest to you if you want to pursue something like this on your own. So I'll show you pictures of some of the resources. There's some examples of books over there that are resources. So scattered throughout, I want to share things that might be relevant or of interest to you all. And I want to acknowledge Andy Mason in the back there. You know, it was mentioned that we have done a food forest article, peer-reviewed journal article, and that was done in conjunction with Andy Mason, who, until he retired and moved to Carefree and dressed a little more casually, he was the director of the USDA National Agroforestry Center. And so he was one of the national leaders in this area of agroforestry, of which food forests are one type of practice. So I wanted to acknowledge Andy, and I'm glad he was able to make it up from Carefree with his colleague Jim Freed, a retired professor from Washington State University. So what is a food forest? I'll give you a little bit of a definition here. It's a multi-layered planting. So when I say multi-layered, I'm talking about you may have overstory trees, tall trees, you may have mid-story trees, you have maybe a ground layer. There's multiple layers. I'll show you a picture in a second. And when I say perennial, I mean species that live more than 1 year. So you can have like corn and things scattered if you have gaps in your food forest. But for the most part, we're talking about perennial species, long-lived species. And they go by different names. I'm going to refer to them primarily as food forests and occasionally as forest garden. There are other names like edible forest garden, agroforest, home garden. To me, they're basically synonyms. Some people want to differentiate based on size. They say a food forest has to be an acre in size or so, and therefore have more of the characteristics of a natural forest. But for my purposes, we'll treat them all the same. So this graphic here shows what could be the different layers of a food forest. They don't necessarily have to have every single one of these layers, but what we're looking at is an overstory that's a canopy layer that may have larger fruit trees and nut trees and things like that. Then you may have a low tree layer that has smaller or dwarf type fruit trees. You can have a shrub layer that's like currants and berries of other kinds, and mostly woody shrubs in that layer. And then you can have herbaceous layer with comfrey and flowering, forbs and things like that. You might have a rhizosphere with root crops of various kinds. You could have a soil surface with ground cover, like strawberries or mints or things like that. And then you could have a vertical layer with climbers, like grapes. Grapes are a really common one in food forests. So you can get a lot more complexity than you would have in a traditional orchard, many different species. Some of these food forests that Andy and I have been able to visit have over 100 species tucked into less than an acre of space. It's really quite amazing. They also can have other layers, and sometimes they talk about having 9 layers, including an aquatic layer. And this can really enhance a food forest if you're able to put in a small pond, and you could have it just kind of a decorative thing, or it could be that you have fish in there or aquatic plants that are edible plants. So you can make it a productive layer of your food forest, or you can just make it a nice little place to spend time. This is that food forest up in Colorado, and they got this beautiful little pond, and they've got that swing there in the back that you can sit in and just kind of enjoy the space. And that to me is one of the values of food forests, is that you enjoy being in them. They're just really pleasant places to be. So getting back to what a food forest is, I mentioned that there's this issue of size, and that some people would say it needs to be an acre or more in size to be a food forest. If it's smaller, you might call it a forest garden. This is a picture from Phoenix of somebody's front yard down there that is a complex, multi-layer, multi-species planting. Is it a food forest? Is it a forest garden? Personally, I don't really care what you call it, but it meets the criteria that I have, in that it's multi-species, multi-layer, and shows what can be done in somebody's front yard in Phoenix in this case. All right, so what roles do they play? Why have a food forest? What's the value? What would be your interest, perhaps, in having a food forest? So obviously a food forest, in its name, right? It's about food production. That's one of the primary goals of a food forest, is to produce food. And you can produce all kinds of food from a food forest. You can have nut trees with pecans or hazelnuts or whatever. You can have all kinds of fruit trees depending on, what physical environment you're in. That can vary, but a lot of fruit can be produced, and the berries and the root crops. So you can produce all kinds of different food, and that kind of goes along with the name. But what about some of the other values? Because I like to think of food forests as multifunctional. In other words, they have all kinds of other functions that they perform besides just providing you some food. Here are a few of them. They can enhance the soil. And I've had the opportunity, and Andy and probably some of the others, to look at food forests and to kind of dig around in the dirt and see what the soil's like. And it's really interesting to compare, say, a mature food forest and the soil with what's immediately adjacent, maybe the next yard over or in the woods right by. And there's so much more organic matter. There's so much more life in the soil. These food forests really do enhance the soil. And along with that, they're storing carbon, which nowadays is an important value of any kind of forest or other type of vegetation. There can be a lot of pollinator activity, especially if you have a lot of flowering plants. And some of those pollinators may pollinate your garden right next door, or farmer's field, or things like that. So there's a pollinator value. You can harvest wood out of a food forest. They're dominated by trees. You can use some of that wood. I think they're beautiful. I think a really well laid out, diverse food forest is just aesthetically very, very pleasing. And they can definitely ameliorate the climate. We're here in the Southwest. Some of you I know are from Phoenix or Tucson or places like that. It's pretty hot, right? And you go into a food forest and you typically feel so much cooler. Maybe a little more humid, but also cooler, just very pleasant. And that's what I mean by ameliorating the climate. And in places like urban areas where it's even hotter, they can add additional value. They can help combat what's called the urban heat island effect. Cities tend to be 5, 10, maybe 15 degrees hotter than surrounding rural areas. So there's other values. But in some ways, to me, it kind of boils down to this thing. It boils down to health. And when I say health, I mean human health. You're ideally benefiting from some really quality food that's about as local as it's ever going to get. You go out and harvest it and bring it in. Very fresh, usually organic. It doesn't have to be, but most food forests are primarily organic production. But in addition to that, you get some additional value from being out in that fresh air, from doing the work, getting the exercise. So there's that physical component and that dietary component. Even I would say a psychological or even a spiritual component to being in a food forest. So there's so many benefits to you as a human, as a person. But then you're improving the environment too. There's increased biodiversity. There's that carbon storage. There's just multiple benefits to the environment. In an urban area, another benefit is they can capture water that might otherwise run into the street, down into the storm drains, and eventually into a sewage treatment plant where it costs money to treat it. So if you can intercept some of that water and use it productively, then that's another kind of environmental benefit. In my experience, most food forests aren't primarily commercial operations. Now, they can be. You can sell products from them. I've seen food forests where they sell food at farmers markets, or they make medicinal products like tinctures and sell those, so you can get this value-added production from them. But most of the ones that I personally have been able to see are done for people's interests, for their own use, maybe for the use in the immediate community. But they can be money-making operations, and we're talking about a food forest here at Arcosanti that will produce products that might go up into the cafe and maybe into the local farmer's market and things like that. So there is that commercial potential that can be realized from a food forest. I really like this quote. So this is a quote from a guy named Robert Hart, who is often credited with popularizing food forests in the temperate regions, because a lot of the food forests started in tropical areas. They've been doing that in the tropics for thousands of years, literally thousands of years. And a lot of us, like myself and others who served in the Peace Corps, my wife, Catherine, we learned about agroforestry in Africa, not in forestry school or other ways in the U.S., and we brought that interest back home. But Robert Hart was a person who lived in England, very unassuming guy, but he developed a food forest there that started to attract a lot of attention. And I love this quote, and it's not really about food forests, but I think you can talk about it as in exactly the same way. So he said, obviously few of us are in a position to restore the forests, but tens of millions of us have gardens or access to open spaces, such as industrial wasteland where trees can be planted, and if full advantage can be taken of the potentialities that are available in heavily built-up areas, new city forests can arise. And food forests, I think, can contribute in a huge way to goals like this. You can tuck food forests into all kinds of different spaces, and I'll be showing you examples of where you can put them in an urban area and really contribute in this kind of way. One food forest isn't going to save the world. Tens of thousands of them will make a difference. The cumulative effect of food forests is really substantial. And another, I think, unappreciated value of food forests, and this one really intrigues me, is the potential to contribute to community development and also community interdependence. And I ran across this book probably about a year ago, by a guy named David Holmgren. Some of you who are into permaculture may know who he is. He's one of the two co-founders of permaculture. He lives in Australia. But he came up with this concept that we should be thinking of suburban areas and even areas in cities that have lots, not as centers of consumption where people just, go to the grocery store, go to work, come back, go watch TV. If you got a little bit of land, why not make it part of a center of production rather than a center of pure consumption? And along with that, why don't you work with your neighbors and become kind of an interdependent network where maybe you grow some things, they grow some other things, you start sharing, you share other kinds of resources, and you become a community based on doing something different with suburbia, which so many of us live in. Really fascinating concept. And food forests, I think, fit really well into this whole larger picture of this vision of retro suburbia. So I wanted to point out that there's a growing amount of resources out there for people who want to learn more about food forests. A few examples are over there on the table of some of these books. Creating a forest garden is maybe one of the best places to start if you want to learn about and think about food forest, even though it's not from the Southwest. It's actually written by a guy in England, but it still has all the information you need to really start thinking about a food forest of your own. And then there are other books like the Community Forest Handbook, Edible Forest Gardens. There's a number of them. And like I said, if you're interested, maybe after the talk, you can take a look at some of the ones on the table. All right, so let's look at some food forests. And I'm going to give you some examples from the Southwest that are in different kinds of physical environments. I'm going to start with the one that is one of the oldest ones. I'm not sure when you started planting, Casey, but this one was started in the 1980s, and it's at a place called the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute, which is up near Basalt, Colorado, closer to Basalt than Aspen. And what you're looking is an aerial image of part of that area. So there's some greenhouses. What you're seeing are some greenhouses and solar collectors at this place called Comfrey or the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute. And I want to give credit to Jerome Osentowski. He's really a pioneer of permaculture and food forests in the Southwest. He learned under the original creators, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, and he's been doing food forest work since really probably even in the 70s, but definitely in the 80s on this property here. And this is an aerial image looking down at that complex. He's got his home. He's got a greenhouse here that's kind of out of the scope of this project, out of this talk. But this greenhouse here is called Phoenix. It's really a large greenhouse. And in that greenhouse at 7,200 feet near Aspen, Colorado, in Basalt, he's got papayas, he's got mangoes, he's got all these tropical plants, and he's growing them in a passively heated greenhouse at that elevation using a technology called climate battery. But then that area outlined in red is the food forest that he has. And you can see it's not massive. It's not even quite an acre. And then there's that number 1 there. And that number 1 is along a path below the greenhouse. And if you go, this is what it looks like. This was that title slide. You can see the nice little path winding through. You've got apples, you've got Asian pears, you've got mulberries, you've got all these understory plants, some of which are edible, some of which are nitrogen fixing. And this picture shows some of the understory complexity in more detail. You've got in this lower corner here, this is a comfrey plant. We've got an example of a comfrey. And you've got just a range of different plants, pollinator plants, Siberian pea shrubs, things like that, or nitrogen fixing. This is where you get that complexity and where you start ending up with 100 species or more. And if you look, there's a circle there. I circled this little sign. If you walk through the complex there, the food forest, you'll see a number of these signs. And if you look more closely at those signs, they may look like this. And this lists the species in just that one immediate area of that food forest. And you can see that there's these overstory trees that are nut and fruit trees. There's some mid-story trees, and then there's things like elderberries, and then they've got grapes, and they've got all those understory plants. Some of them are labeled as nitrogen fixing or insectary, by which he means pollinator plants that attract pollinators. And if you go to all the different signs and look at them, you'll realize there's over 100 species in that one little food forest. It's a very diverse, very well-kept, very productive food forest. But it's mature. It's been since the 1980s, that they started. I'd be more than willing to send you the PDF version of this presentation, and if you got it, you can click on links. And like this link here in the upper left is a link with an interview of Jerome Osentowski sitting in his greenhouse, and then he walks out into the food forest and he talks about permaculture. He talks about what he's trying to do. He also has this really nice book called The Forest Garden Greenhouse. And then the National Geographic did a really short video on Martin Crawford's food forest in England. He's the guy who wrote Creating a Forest Garden. And so really well filmed with drone shots and things like that. Both of these are really, really nice videos. And again, at the end I'll have my email. If you want, you shoot me an email, I'll send you the PDF. And all you have to do is click on the link and it comes up for you. So that's kind of a rural or maybe peri-urban food forest. It's only a couple miles outside of Basalt. Looks very rural, but it's right outside of town. Let's talk about urban ones, because I think, a lot of you may come from urban areas, and Arcosani is an experiment in urban living. And so let's talk about examples in urban environments. And here's one from Farmington. It doesn't exactly jump out at you, but there's a food forest right in the middle of this very densely settled scene here. And if you zoom in on it a little more, this is what it looks like. You Google Earth image. And what I want to point out here is there's some really large trees in this food forest that aren't even fruit trees. They're like native or non-native, timber type trees. But you can see there's a lot of gaps where you can see all the way down to the ground. There's spaces where there's other things growing in a higher light environment. Then if you get down on the ground, there's, again, a network of little paths. You got apricot trees. You got all kinds of fruit trees. And the woman who created this has a list online of all the species she's tried planting. And this is just the top of the list. Goes on and on. There's 160 species or varieties of species in this. And it's just really a very impressive place. I don't think anybody here other than Andy and I have been to that. But it's really a very fascinating... It's I think it was about 2/3 of an acre. It's not even quite an acre in size. The whole property is about an acre, but the food forest in the back is a little bit less. She also has an aquatic layer, a little small pond. She has a little greenhouse. She has chickens. It's really just quite a fascinating spot. And when the first time I visited, it was like 90-some degrees, and you walk in and it's shady and really pleasant. And it was fun. So you can do these things in a place like Farmington. You can do them in Tucson. One of the things we found down in Tucson when we were doing a survey of food forests was that sometimes you can have them beautifully landscaped and be part of an apartment or co-housing complex. And there are two examples in Tucson that Andy and I and Catherine were able to visit. One is called Stone Curves Co-housing and the other is Sonoran Co-housing. And these were professionally landscaped, and they have swales, they use gray water, but they're food-producing landscapes. They're edible landscapes, and they're very aesthetically pleasing as well. And you can see maybe a corrugated tank here. They're making very thorough use of rainwater storage. They got swales that slow the flow and hold the water back. They're just beautifully designed in very aesthetically pleasing places to spend time. One of my most favorite examples, though, is what's going on in Tucson. So you're familiar with it. That's great. Yeah, so this is a neighborhood in Tucson where a person named Brad Lancaster and his brother Rod moved in the 1990s, mid-1990s. And you can see a picture of their house. It was an 1/8-acre property, and between their property and the street was about a 20-acre right-of-way, this kind of flat, bare area. And the whole neighborhood consists of that flat, bare right-of-way. And so what Brad did and his brother was they started to plant stuff. They planted in their own property, this 1/8-acre property, and then they planted in the right-of-way, the public right-of-way. And the way they worked that was they created some rainwater basins so that water from the street irrigates those trees that you see. And this picture here on the lower right is a picture from, I don't know, it's probably almost a decade ago. And so the trees are even bigger. It's just a beautiful place. But the amazing thing about this neighborhood is that it's not just Brad who did this. He has encouraged many, many of his neighbors to do the same thing. And it has made a significant difference in this entire neighborhood. And really, I think, transformed it dramatically. And to me, this project is an intersection. It's agroforestry on the urban scale, because a lot of the plants you see there are edible plants. The trees are things like mesquite and desert ironwood that have edible pods. There are a lot of fruit trees. There are cacti that are edible. There's all kinds of edible plants, mostly native plants. And so what you have is a food forest distributed through the entire neighborhood, partly on private property, partly in the public rights of way. So it's improving the environment in that urban area, urban forestry. It's producing food, and it's helping develop that community and bring that community together. And I'll show you an example in a second. We were down there when a pretty hot day, the time that Andy and Catherine and I were there. And if you walk through that neighborhood, there's some areas that you can see the old original condition of the right-of-way where nothing's been planted, and that's in the foreground here. Then you walk into an area where they've done some planting. You got trees, it's shady, it's beautiful, it's cool. Just a dramatic night and day difference that's being made in this neighborhood. One house, one one right away at a time. But then there's the community development aspect. And it started with harvesting rainwater and planting trees and planting other plants. And it's expanded to artwork. It's expanded to developing roundabouts to slow the traffic in the streets, to community events where they harvest and have mesquite pancake breakfasts. But if you walk through that neighborhood, you'll see examples of artwork, sculptures, signs. I don't know how clearly it shows the Gila monster there. All these kinds of things. It started with trees. It started with irrigating those trees, and it's moved on to community gatherings. It's moved on to artwork. It has really increased the livability and the value of that neighborhood, in my opinion. If you walk through that neighborhood and then walk beyond the influence of their work, it's night and day. It's really, really, really different. And then there's what's happening here, Arco Santi, right down the hill here. We have a food forest project that's much younger than the ones I've showed you so far, but it's getting off to a promising start, exciting start. And it's right here. And I wanted to put up a couple quotes here from the creator, the founder, the person who inspired Arco Santi. Some of you probably know the name Paolo Soleri. Some of you even knew Paolo Soleri, who are in this audience. I never met him. But I was reading something the other day that he wrote, and there were two quotes that I found relevant in the context of this talk. And so let me turn around and read those. Well, I'll read them off of here. So, the flat acreage below the cliffs is cultivated to provide some of the vegetables used by the cafe and residents. The main intent is to interface the urban character of the project with the natural setting of the 860 acres owned by the Cosanti Foundation. And all you have to do is look out this window, and you're looking at that flat area he's talking about. And, we're helping to bring back some of that agriculture that was what he really envisioned for that area. And then this other quote, the habitat and agriculture must work gracefully in tandem. And I don't know that there's any better example than a food forest of agriculture and habitat working in tandem. But, to me, that's a great example of exactly what he had in mind for that area you see down there. As well as to some degree the landscaping around here, which is edible as well. But anyway, we're working down there on a food forest project, and we started with this area that's kind of enclosed partially by some Arizona cypress, and right in here we've been planting fruit trees, and we're going to be planting some understory trees, and David here is kind of the leader of that project. That area that you see in blue is a remnant of mesquite bosque that used to spread over much more of this area down below. And we're going to convert that into a food forest based entirely on native plants. So we've been pruning to get a little more light in there, and we're going to be starting to plant native food producing or medicinal plants under and among the mesquite, to give a different example, because inside that rectangle, it's mostly non-native. It's apples and peaches and things like that. But outside, it's going to be, inside the blue, it's going to be native species. And then this area here was recently planted with about 45, I think, fruit trees, and it's going to be more of a kind of a traditional orchard with trees in rows and things. And so, I'm an educator. To me, one thing that's really exciting about this is that we can bring people down there and look at contrasting models of agriculture, of food production, all right together. So this is an exceptional opportunity here to do education and outreach and extension, as well as to produce food for the cafe and maybe the local farmers market. We worked with somebody who had taken a permaculture design course who used to teach at Orem School, and she developed this layout of the food forest, and just like the pictures I showed you, there's kind of this network of paths, and we dug shallow basins, and we've been planting in those basins, and we're gradually trying to see this vision through in terms of a fully developed food forest. This is what it looked like about a year ago from the air. You can see that we laid out the paths. You can see that network of paths, I think. In between the paths are mostly shallow basins. So you can see some spots where trees were planted. And you can see right up above here is where the orchard is, and just over to the right will be where the mesquite is. But this is where we're heading. To me, it's really exciting about the educational potential. I mentioned that. I'm an educator. I work at Northern Arizona University. Already, well over 100 people have been down there. You know, these groups from like AmeriCorps and Pacific Discovery have come down for day trips. And then you have your workshop people and some NAU students who've been down and others. And it's just really kind of cool to see what's happening with people coming down and experiencing the food forest, even though it's just getting going already. It's been an educational opportunity for us. Hopefully you'll stick around for the next talk at 1:30. Kat Thompson, who was a graduate of our School of Forestry, she's a Navajo woman. She's going to talk about edible landscaping, but I'm sure it's going to be from an indigenous perspective. And on the reservations around here, there are lots of opportunities and need for food production, opportunities for food forests. And there are some great examples, one of which is the Hopi-Tuxtla Permaculture Institute up on the Hopi Reservation. Then there's Flowering Tree Permaculture Institute over in Santa Clara, Pueblo over New Mexico, that are kind of leading the way. And I think we'll hear more about those from Kat Thompson at 1:30. So I don't want to tread on anything she'll talk about. So let me switch to the challenges, because there are challenges in establishing a food forest and maintaining it. I could probably come up with a long list, but I decided to come up with 4 potential challenges. I'm not going to mention rubbers or some of the weeds that we dealt with last time. The question I get a lot is, we're in the Southwest. Why are you doing this? We don't have enough water. Where are you going to get your water? And that kind of thing. So water is really something you have to face head on. Some of the Southwest is known for having really tough soil conditions. You got the caliche soils down in Phoenix. You got soil compaction in urban areas. There are multiple challenges, low organic matter, all these kind of challenges. How do we deal with those? Costs. These things aren't necessarily cheap to establish. And then knowledge. And, a lot of people just aren't aware these things even exist. And if they are aware they exist, they have no idea how to do it themselves. There's that lack of knowledge. So recently I've been reading some things that I would call Stoic Philosophy. And this is my response to challenges. Yeah, there's challenges, but there are ways around them. And in fact, challenges bring out the creativity in people. And to me, that's kind of exciting that we actually have some obstacles. We have some challenges to think about. It's actually kind of stimulating. So I think the way you should look at it, that they're not just things that bother you or nuisances, but they're things that could be opportunities for growth and creativity. So let's talk about water. Some of the food forests we got to were very, very fortunate that they had access to water. Maybe it was old historic water rights. Greg Peterson, who spoke here about a month ago, this is his front yard, and he actually has access to flood irrigation. So he's got a ditch in the backyard that dates back to when that area was an orange grove, and he has rights, and so he can flood this whole front yard and backyard several times a year. And he took us and showed us this fruit tree in the front yard and how he's got these bricks around it. But notice there's a gap, and that gap here is for the water to come in when he floods the front yard. He also does rainwater harvesting and other things, but he has that good fortune of having access to flood irrigation. Others that we saw have, maybe have a shallow aquifer they can pump from or whatever. But what about the rest of us who don't have that kind of thing? Don Titmus, that's a picture of Don Titmus there. He's going to speak next week, and he's going to talk entirely about rainwater harvesting. And that's his backyard there. And he has rainwater collection cisterns where he has gutters he can drain into the cisterns. But you may be able to see that he has a line of buckets as well, because he doesn't have gutters on every part of his roof. And so he's got a line of 5-gallon buckets. So he captures every little drop he can and uses that to irrigate his property. And he's very creative, and I think he'll give you a really interesting talk next week if you're able to come back to that. And then there's what's going on down in Brad Lancaster's neighborhood in Dunbar Spring, where they're harvesting rain right off the street using either a curb core or a curb cut. And the curb core is nothing more than a hole drilled into the curb. Curb cut is just a section of the curb cut out. And in both cases, it leads to an infiltration basin like you see here, so that when you get a monsoon rain event, water literally fills this thing right up and percolates in and irrigates those plants. And for the most part, that is the way they irrigate all their plants, is with street runoff captured in these infiltration basins, and then they plant around it. One additional thing that helps is to mulch those basins, and you can see Brad, actually that's Brad there, standing in a basin that's full of wood chips and mulch. Anytime they prune, if they can chip it up, they chip it up, they break stuff up, they put the leaves in there, and they create this organic mulch that helps retain that moisture. Very creative way to use rainwater, and it's free, and it's also keeping it out of the sewage treatment plant. And then he goes beyond that to use gray water. And a number of these folks that we visited do use gray water, water coming out of showers, water washing machines and sinks. But again, Brad is often a leader in doing these things creatively. He's got a washing machine that's in an outdoor shed, and the drain pipe, which would normally go into the sewer system, this flexible pipe you see that goes into the orange right now, you can pull that out and put it into the fig or into the pomegranate or into the white suppose. So every time he does a load of wash, he pulls it out and puts it in the other pipe, and he's using water that otherwise is complete wastewater. He talks all the time about taking what used to be considered waste and turning it into resources, whereas typically we take resources and turn them into waste. We turn clean water into wastewater. He turns wastewater into irrigation water. So the bottom line here is we can do things creatively in the Southwest with limited water supplies to grow food for us. So don't let people say, yeah, I can't do it or you shouldn't do it. We can use water for productive purposes. It improves our environment. I have examples of Brad's book over there, Rainwater Harvesting, a 2-volume set that really digs into this. And, he asked me to write a blurb. He asked Andy to write a blurb for the new volume. And so I wrote a blurb saying, you can't read a chapter of that where you don't want to go out and get a tool from your garage and start putting a swale in or something like that. It's just so inspiring. And his TED Talk is incredibly inspiring, in my opinion. But, it's dry here. Phoenix is dry, but people will say, if they're from Jordan, where this permaculture forest is, and they're going to say, you got twice as much rainfall as we do. And look at what they can do. There's a food forest being established near the Dead Sea in Jordan that has really come on strongly, and it's just an inspiring example of what can be done with a little bit of creativity. Soil's another problem. I'm not going to spend as much time on soil, but if you're in an urban area like Phoenix, your soil is probably pretty hard, pretty compact, may have that caliche impermeable layer, probably doesn't have much organic matter. What do you do about that? The example that Don Titmus showed us, and several others as well, is that you add organic matter to the surface. And down in Phoenix, where you have tree care companies chipping up trees and material like that, sometimes they'll take it and dump it in your driveway if you ask them to do that. And then you can spread it out and build up the organic layers in your soil. And quite a few people in Phoenix and Tucson are doing exactly that. And in fact, like everything else, there's an app for that. There's an app called Chip Drop, where if you can log into Chip Drop, you can actually log in and make requests online, and they will come and drop off a load if they're working in your neighborhood. Maybe more than you want, because they'll dump the whole truck, but it's a win-win, because you get organic matter. They don't have to take it all to the dump and pay a tipping fee, So it's, again, one of those win-win situations, just like harvesting rainwater from the street. And Don also has done his best to break up the soil, because he had pretty compacted kind of clay layer. And with physical labor, he has loosened that surface layer and then added organic matter on top of it. And he's gradually improving that soil pretty substantially. So you can deal with the soil. There's solutions to dealing with the soil, just like there are with the water. And then there's the cost. So I got online yesterday, looked up Waters Garden Center here in Prescott, and looked at the prices of fruit trees at Prescott, at Waters Garden Center. And I don't know that many of you can read, but these are prices that are ranging from like $87 to $122 per tree in a 5-gallon size, which isn't, a massive size. You can get them cheaper in some places. Verde River Growers, I think, sells them a bit cheaper, but still, you're paying $40 to $100 quite often per tree for a fruit tree that's, this tall or a little taller. And a lot of people want to start with a fruit tree that big. That's one way to do it. But if you buy 40 or 100 fruit trees, and keep in mind, you don't have to do that. You can do a really small planting with 5 or 10. But if you wanted to do a bigger food forest, it gets expensive. It does. And so how do you deal with that? Well, people can ride to the rescue, like Casey here, Casey Jones, who's in the audience. Casey is quite a knowledgeable person about plant propagation. He can grow plants from seed. He can grow plants by grafting, from cuttings. So there are a few examples over here of plants established with cuttings, where you take a dormant piece of twig and you put it in the soil and it sprouts. So you can save a lot of money, and also it's just enjoyable to do your own plant propagation. And you can network with other people and exchange. Maybe they have cuttings of one species, you have cuttings of another. You can share and kind of have that community sense develop. So, take a look at those. Maybe talk to Casey afterwards. He's got an amazing food forest right down the road in Spring Valley. Really just a really nice example that you can do right here in this immediate environment. And then there's the whole knowledge issue of, if you don't know anything about food forests, how do you learn about food forests? And we're actually pretty blessed here in this part of the state, in this part of the Southwest, really, part of the country, to have some really nice networks where you can tap for knowledge. One really nice example is the LEAF network, Linking Edible Arizona Forests. And they have online quite a few resources about fruit trees that are suitable for the desert versus Prescott versus Flagstaff, and just a lot of information. That publication called Growing Edible Arizona Forests, I have a copy of it over there if you wanted to look at. But all that information is available free online. And it's not only knowledge, but it's inspiration that you get from these kind of networks. Two other examples, both of which involve speakers in this series. The Urban Farm, they have a fruit tree program down in Phoenix. Greg Peterson leads that effort, and he was a speaker here just recently. And then Don Titmus, he lives in a place that he calls the Bee Oasis. That's his little property over in Mesa. And he gives tours there. He does permaculture courses, and he'll be here next week. And so you got great examples of people that Norm has connected with and brought to this lecture series. And then there's Brad Lancaster and some of his colleagues down in Tucson. If you don't do anything else to follow up on this talk, the one thing I recommend, Google Brad Lancaster TED Talk. That's all you need to do. Brad Lancaster TED Talk. Or you can do Planting the Rain TED Talk. It is really, it's not only entertaining, but it's very, very inspiring TED Talk. Then there are his books that he wrote. And then he is part of a group down there called Desert Harvesters, which promote foraging as well as planting native species. They even produced a cookbook called Eat Mesquite and More to encourage people to use native species and maybe plant native species. And it's kind of a nice book. So about that. And then there's this newest networking effort, and it's called the Southwest Agroforestry Action Network. And just in a few weeks, really, we're going to be meeting up in Moab, the meeting of this group. We're going to meet, we're going to see some food forests, we're going to tour some, we're going to have talks about them. Kelly Bull's going to be there, who you guys know. So I don't know that on relatively short notice anybody else is going to join us up in Moab, but you'd be very welcome to. Andy has been very involved in organizing this meeting, so I just wanted to make sure to promote that. That's right. That's a good point, Andy. You could register and attend it virtually. And then to wind down here, I just wanted to have some conclusions about food forests in this region, based on the kind of work Andy and I have done and the experience we've been gaining here, for example. And one conclusion is you can make these things here. There are great examples already here that show that it can be done, and it can be done creatively using good water practices, good soil management practices, good pest management practices. Definitely it is possible. Some people say it's too hot, you can't do food forests here, but you can. There are great examples. A lot of the food forests that we've seen have that supplemental water source, like, flood irrigation, maybe an aquifer. Some people even use city water, but most people are using rainwater. And if it's not their sole source, it's their primary source. And that's what we need to do. We need to use rainwater wherever possible. They're definitely growing in number. There are new ones being established, including the one down the hill here, the one in Glendale Public Library. There's a number of them that are being established. So it is a growing practice in both number and physical growth of plants. But we need more good demonstration sites. We need more effective promoters of food forests. They definitely can address this urban heat island effect. And if you're from a city, I think most of you have been in a city anyway, of Phoenix or Tucson in the summer, you know how hot it can be. If you walk under some trees, you're cooler. And if you get a concentration of trees, you're cooling that environment. If you have trees on certain sides of your house, south side maybe, you can keep the house cooler. You can reduce your air conditioning costs. There's, multiple benefits of having trees in that urban environment. They can promote both biodiversity, the variety of plants and animals, for sure. You go into a food forest and you sit quietly and you'll notice there are more birds, more insects. And then it can promote agrobiodiversity. You can be growing heritage varieties of plants. You can grow rarer species, things like that, and protect maybe the native traditional varieties. There's all kinds of agrobiodiversity potential with these food forests. And then they can be a great community building activity. If you get your neighbors involved, if you have kind of a dispersed food forest, maybe using the public rights of way, you're building a stronger community in doing this along the way.
With gray water and water that comes off the streets, typically there's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to be in that water that may not be fantastic for plants. An example I can think of that would come off the streets would be oils that are coming from the concrete. How do plants handle toxins that can be in water?
Yeah, that's a question that comes up periodically that I'd love to see more study of, for one thing. So I'm not going to say that it's not a problem at all, and there's no place where it's not a problem, because it could be. There's been a little work in Brad Lancaster's neighborhood, which, isn't a huge traffic volume area, but sure, after the first monsoon rain, there's probably still stuff that washes into those basins. The only research done in his immediate neighborhood that addresses that question is a study where they looked at some of the soil fauna. They looked specifically at nematodes, and they found that there was really healthy nematode populations in those basins, and especially in the basins that had the organic mulch, because some of them, they have stone mulch, but others that have organic mulch. They were finding no indication in the soil fauna of problems related to contamination. Now, you may have residual issues in some urban soils like lead and things like that you need to be aware of. One thing that I've read a fair amount on urban agriculture, and because that's a common concern in urban agriculture, like community gardens and things in urban areas. If you are concerned, one of the things you do is you build up the soil with newer soil, this organic matter, get some of the activity above the residual soil. But also, a lot of these plants, they've found that they may uptake some of these chemicals but they don't typically get into the fruit of the chemical of the plants, and so it can often be safe to eat the fruit, but not say the stem. You know, in a case where my stems might conceivably be edible. So it is something to be aware of, and maybe to consider doing some testing on. But from what I can tell, it's not really a big problem in neighborhoods like Brad's. You know, maybe if you're a neighborhood sitting on an old industrial site, and that does happen occasionally, then, you know, you may have heavy metals in the soil that you need to be aware of. And some, you know, the most dramatic step would be to scrape some of that layer off and replace it with other kind of soil. But you definitely need to be aware that it is a potential problem, but that I think it's a problem that's maybe less of a concern in a lot of situations than people suspect it to be. But it's worthy of more research. So I'll go to her then.
Thank you.
Just a comment to that. I don't know. Roly-polies, those little insects, you know, they take heavy metals out of the environment, and I know when you put that litter layer on top of there, they're under there working away, so that might be helpful to mitigate some of that heavy metal issue.
Yeah, when you get a lot of biological activity in the soil, it can deal with a lot of those chemicals. I mean, it's not going to get rid of the lead necessarily, but it's still going to be there, but it may transform it. But a lot of the organics can be literally transformed into less harmful compounds through soil activity, bacteria, fungi, roly-polies, whatever the case may be. So the more organics you get in the soil, I think the better you are able to deal with those kind of challenges. But it definitely pays to be aware of them. There's a great book, by the way, written by a layperson for other lay people called Earth Repair, and it's aimed at urban bioremediation. So using biological techniques to remediate soil contamination in urban environments for restoration projects or for agricultural projects. And so there's a growing body of knowledge about how to deal with those kind of problems. But you can't just wish them away. You know, you got to think about them, be aware of them, maybe do the soil sampling to understand what you have. And it's possible in some cases to screen some of that stuff out of an infiltration basin, so that you may not be able to screen oil, but maybe some of the bigger pieces of trash that could become contaminant, you can screen it before it gets into the basin. So there are different strategies, but it's a critical issue in urban environments to be aware of. So you had a question?
They're also used for cleaning water and cleaning areas.
Yeah.
And also, not just plants, but like rhizomes, the fungi, all that kind of stuff. That's really being, they use that kind of thing over in the garbage dump in Prescott, where they just put all this, it was fungus stuff that was eating up all the toxins, and it was a toxic dump. So it's really cleaned it up.
Yeah, it's amazing what plants can do if you have the right kind of plants. And you know, I teach a wetland course up in NEU, wetland ecology, and we talk a little bit about using wetlands, so-called constructed wetlands, for wastewater treatment. And you can treat a lot of different kind of wastes with plants. And there's a whole field. There's journals in bioremediation using plants and other organisms to treat various kinds of contamination. So you can do that kind of stuff.